Okay. Thank you, Andy, and thanks for coming along. Rural wages in Asia, the motivation for this is it's a piece of work that Sharada Keats, who sat there, and myself have done with DFID money under the Shockwatch facility. And our motivation for doing this was we spend most of our time looking at African issues, but every now and again we read across and we see something in Asia. And we began to keep stumbling across reports of rising wages in Asia, and we thought, well, that's not. We'd known that wages have been going up, and then we started to poke around a little bit more and found some quite striking indications of rising rural wages, and then said, well, we need to chase this one down. We need to have at least a good preliminary look at what we think's happening. Are we in fact seeing rural wages rising across Asia, or have we just got a couple of headline statistics and imagine that this applies across the swathe of Asia? And if it is happening, what are the causes? Is it the most obvious causes, or is it something else that lies behind it? Is this a blip on the map? Is it a trend? Can we expect it to go forward? And if it is going forward, what are the implications? And basically, that's what I'm going to tell you about over the next 30 minutes or so. So the first point is to remind ourselves, for those of us who are ag economists, we don't need reminding very much about this, that rural wages really matter. And despite Asia being a rapidly urbanizing and industrializing society, it is still the case that the majority of poverty, and particularly extreme poverty, is a rural phenomenon. So on the last statistics I could easily get here for about 2008, 55% of Asians were classed as living in poverty and 27% in extreme poverty. That is living on less than the equivalent of $1.25 a day. And of those extreme poor, 72% of them are in rural areas, and that makes a total of 687 million rural Asians who still live in extreme poverty. So those rural wages really matter because most of those people living in poverty at some point are working for casual, unskilled wages, either on fields or in informal businesses in the rural non-farm economy. And there's a stat for rural India. Almost 40% of the workforce depend on casual work for the majority of their income. We also know that unskilled rural wages are closely linked to poverty. We've got all kinds of work in India that shows a close association between the wage levels in rural areas and certainly levels of deep poverty. And we know the consequences of those rural wages can be profound. Apart from the direct effect upon poverty, we have an impact upon the cost of production for food, because this affects the agricultural wage rate, and it affects the minimum level at which you can offer jobs in the manufacturing sector, because manufacturing in Asia is growing in part by drawing out rural labour, and if the rural minimum wage starts to move upwards, then it bids up what you've got to offer in the factories. So there are important knock-on implications. So that's why it matters. And we had our three questions that we set ourselves. Is it true that rural wages are rising in Asia? And are they accelerating? Because there is some evidence, and you'll see it in just a moment, that suggests that it may have accelerated since the mid-2000s, very recently. And if so, what are those causes? And if so, what are the consequences? So that's the territory we're going to cover. So those are the countries we've looked at. Now, this is called rural wages in Asia. It's actually rural wages in South, Southeast, and East Asia. And we took those countries which have got more than 20 million people, which is why Bhutan, Laos, and Cambodia are not in green there, but it's most of the countries in this arc from South, Southeast and East Asia. And that's where we looked for the evidence. The evidence isn't terrifically thick, but there's enough evidence to give us some kind of traction on the questions we're looking at. So first off, what are the trends on rural wages? And the first one we're going to look at is we're going to look at 5 provinces, sort of medium provinces in China. These earner will have at least one other dependent, an old person or a child to support with that wage. They're not earning every single day of the year. So to get to $1.25 a day average consumption level, our extreme poverty line, you've basically got to be making $5 a day. And they're across China. We've only got Jilin up there in the northeast, where we're getting close to the $5 a day. It's quite surprising, because this is 20 years after the agricultural revolution began in China. So the wages have, until rather recently, have been very poor indeed. Now, if we run it ahead to 2003, the answer is that in every part but Jilin, those wages have nudged up. But it's nudged up. It's nothing spectacular. But then on the latest data that we've got of the series that we were able to find, 2007, look at what we've got. Boom, 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 boom. Now, we're all way above $5 a day, and in some cases we're pushing past $8 a day. It's a transformation. We've more than doubled the wages within a decade here in China. So that's the case of China. And of course, most of you in the room will be saying, well, China's pretty special, very rapid economic growth. We'd expect to see extraordinary results from China. Okay, let's have a look at Vietnam. And here we've got a data series going back to the early 1990s for 8 different regions in Vietnam. Now, this is not in US dollars per day. It is in constant units. And if anybody's wondering what those units are, the thousands of dong per day, but they are standardized dongs, so we can look at them through time. And here we go. Through the 1990s, those wages are going up, but there's a tremendous diversity of wages across the regions. And down there in the northeast, where people are being paid a total pittance back in 1992. It's only in the Mekong Delta that you start getting bigger wages being paid. As we come into the 2000s, those wages run into the doldrums. Then they accelerate a bit, and on our most recent data points, up to 2008, there we've got that same strange takeoff. And the wages over a period of, 17, 18 years, they're up 3 to 4 times in Vietnam in real terms, and they're also converging regionally. The very poorest one there, the northeast, has seen some of the strongest wage increases, and the Mekong is no longer the place where people are being paid the most. So a lot of good news. That's from Vietnam. Okay, well, Southeast and East Asia are probably the best performers of the data we're looking at. So what happens if we start looking at some South Asian data? This is Bangladesh, and we're looking from the beginning of the 2000s to round about 2011. And what you can see there, the solid line is the rural wage rate deflated by the consumer price index. And you can see it's growing gradually from 01 to 2007. But once again, it's moving faster more recently than it was before. Now, it's not a spectacular increase from Bangladesh, but it is going up. And actually in Bangladesh, you can see that it's beginning to converge with the urban wage rate, which is the dotted line above it. I was in Dhaka in February this year, and somebody came up to me from IRI and said, we're doing village studies in IRI, and he said, you do realise that landlords in Bangladesh can't get labour. They're mechanising because they can't get labour. And I said, come again? And he said, yeah, that's what's going on at the moment. They can't get labour, they're mechanising. You say, this is rural Bengal. For 300 years or longer in rural Bengal, you only had to put a threepenny bit on the table and you could hire people for almost any length of time you wanted. This is the most densely settled part of the world. It has been some of the poorest parts of the world. Agricultural wage rates have been pitifully low for a long time. They are now moving up, and we're getting reports of labour shortages in rural Bengal. I mean, this is just music to your ears. As an agricultural economist, this is what you dream of hearing, rural labour shortages in Bangladesh. It's fantastic. There's the India story. This is Gulati and colleagues' work, and they've presented the data there for India from the early 1990s to 2012 or so. They've put trend lines and all the rest on it. And you can see the rural wages there were growing rather quickly at the equivalent of 3.7% per year annual average in the 90s. Then they've gone into the doldrums in the first half of the 2000s, but they've recovered. And they appear to be moving back to a very pleasing trend. It's not as fast as it was, 2.1% per average, per annum on average, but it appears once again to be accelerating in the second half of the 2000s. So that's what we're seeing for those particular countries. Now, we could show you data from several other countries, but I will tell you, you can see it in the full report, that the summary evidence is that in most of these countries, those rural wages have been rising since 2000, and in most cases from before that. Some of them do show this acceleration from the mid-2000s onwards. There are gender aspects. When we get wages broken down by sex, we find that women are typically paid 25 to 33%, a quarter to a third, less than men. Where we can see that through time, the gap is narrowing, but it's not narrowing anything fast. You know, it's a slow narrowing. It's moving in the right direction, but slowly so. And in some cases, we are finding regional convergence, as I've shown you in China and Vietnam. So, rural wages are moving up in Asia. Now, the next question is, what caused this? Well, look, there's lots of qualitative description of changing wages in particular places, but we checked it out at national level using a very primitive form of multiple regression, where we said, let's see if we can trace the rise in wages against the following potential determinants. And we had increasing agricultural productivity as a potential determinant. We had the growth of manufacturing industry, and then at other times we put manufacturing and service industry as an alternative measure. We had the growth of the rural population, and we had a time shifter dummy set at around the middle of the 2000s to see if there was any evidence that independently of anything else, things were intensifying in the latter half of the last decade. And this is what we found. Amazingly, we got some significant estimates in there. The magnitude of the parameters are all over the place, but the direction is very clear and robust. So here is the single biggest cause. And this one caught us out late in the day by surprise, because we hadn't quite clocked this, being silly economists. And here's the big story that drives it. It's rural population. Now what we're going to look at here is rural populations from 2004 to 2013 for Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Korea, Indonesia and China. So it's Southeast and East Asia. But something is happening there, and I hadn't quite realized it was going on. And the moment you realize this going on, you say, boy, way too much time under the duvet. You're not checking enough on what's happening in the world you're living in. But I'm comforted that recent blogs from China say that the leadership in Beijing still thinks that, there are more people in the Chinese countryside year by year. Not true. If we step this one through, look at it. Down, 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 all the way through, it's down. All of those countries, I think all of those countries, most of those countries, and particularly China, are now losing rural population. It's astonishing, losing rural population. Those of us who are old-time agricultural economists, we've grown up with a narrative which always says that even if people are leaving the villages, we've still got more people in the villages, more pressure on the land. How do we create jobs and livelihoods for them? It's not true in a big swathe of Asia. Now, South Asia is different. The population is still nudging up there. But sooner or later, they're going to go over the crest of the hill and start coming down like the rest of Asia. Now, your first answer to this is the strength of rural-urban migration. And clearly that contributes to falling rural populations. But I think that isn't the full driver. We haven't had time, we haven't got the money, we haven't got the time to do the proper demographic analysis. But I think the big driver here is underlying fertility. So let's just remind ourselves, this is Asian fertility rates for lots and lots of countries, but there's also two thick lines in this, which are South Asia and East Asia. And this goes all the way back to the 1960s, yeah? So if we go for the 1960s, look at those Asian fertility rates. This is the average number of children born to women in their fertile years. It's all 6, it's 7 per woman through their fertile years, 50 odd years ago. And those of us who were in high school in the late 1960s, we were overcome by Malthusian pessimism because this is what we saw from Asia. Falling death rates, but obstinately high birth rates, levels of fertility. It will simply not be possible for Asia to save itself under this explosive growth of population. Then look what happens over the next 40 or 50 years as we trace this one through. There it is, down, 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 down. It actually starts to level off because the levels have gotten so low in that. Now, if you look at the big brown line in there, that's the overall measure for East Asia and the Pacific. That's Southeast Asia, East Asia and the Pacific. Look how low it's got. The overall measure now is below 2. It's way below the natural replacement rate of 2.1. There's half a dozen Asian countries that are below 2.1. Sooner or later, their entire populations are going down. Well, we know that China's population will peak before the year 2030 and will be moving down pretty swiftly on that. South Asia is that sort of lime, washed out green thick line. Well, that's not come down to the same level, but even that is down to 3 point something by now. It's less than half what it was 50 years ago. Those fertility rates are quite spectacular. And it's changing the reality of rural Asia.
Steve, is that only rural? Or is it rural?
No, that's national. That's national. It'd be nice to get some rural specific ones as well, but on a quick search, I could only nail some national ones.
I was just checking because you said rural fertility.
So this is the big surprise to us, that demographics should be driving it rather than good, solid economic factors. And of course, because you don't expect that as an economist, you weren't alive to it at the beginning of the research planning. But it's clearly a huge story, known only to all medical professionals, family planners, etc., etc. So our second variable was one of our economic variables. The next biggest driver was the growth of manufacturing. And what you're looking at there is annual growth rates of manufacturing across Asian countries for the late 1990s, early 2000s, and for the second half of the 2000s. What you can see there is what is pretty well known. Asian growth of manufacturing in many countries is extraordinarily rapid. In many places it's more than 7% per annum. That's double your money every 20 years. You can see that sort of pattern for China, for Vietnam, for Bangladesh, and so on. In some cases it's slowing down more recently, in other cases it's accelerating, but you've got some pretty strong performances there, although you've got some weaker performances in there like Pakistan, Nepal, Indonesia. But the variations in the growth of manufacturing correspond to the variations in the growth of rural wages. It's a strong determinant. We couldn't find agricultural productivity, which, by the way, is growing rapidly in Asia. We couldn't find that as a significant determinant of the rises in wages. That might be that we just don't have enough data to show it, but that didn't come out as significant. We did find the time shifter was significant by a very, very small margin. Clearly the heavy lift is done by the demography and the growth of manufacturing, but there is a time shifter and we've no idea why the time shifter applies. So these processes are intensifying with time for reasons unknown. So that's the causes, and that just leaves us to ponder the implications of this. Now, The implications of this, if the causes are the slowdown of rural population growth and the growth of manufacturing, those are two drivers that ain't going to stop tomorrow. So one can confidently predict that these rural wages will continue to rise. Yeah, we're not expecting manufacturing industry to choke to a halt tomorrow, and the demographic drivers are hardwired, you know, with those falling fertility rates. They're hardwired into the system. So we can expect these trends to continue. So if so, what are the implications? Well, the first one, of course, is the momentous one. This has to be the end of mass extreme poverty in rural Asia. There's 678 million people in deep poverty. They're going to come out of it in the next decade or so if these trends continue. It won't be the end of all poverty. There are people who can't work their way out of poverty, disability, addiction, old age, no workers in the household, and so on. There will still be candidates for social protection. But I think we can start to talk about this any time now. I suppose if we had more time and could play with our models, we could predict when we get the average wage above $5 a day, at which point most people are going to be heading out of extreme poverty, and pretty soon after that heading out of poverty full time. You'll see on this slide I've stuck over on the left-hand corner, just for the oldies in the room, those of us who can remember it, Gunnar Myrdal's document from 1968, Asian drama, 3 clunking huge volumes that Gunnar Myrdal wrote at the time. Pessimism about the future of Asia. Asia cannot produce the agricultural gains, the industrial gains against rapid population growth, ever to get itself out of heat, poverty and dust. That was Gunnar's very pessimistic assessment in 1968, and when you looked at the data in 1968, Asia's prospects looked absolutely appalling. The great news, and I'm sure Gunnar would be delighted from his grave to know this epoch is passing. And, you know, as far as I can say, it's just wonderful, wonderful news. Okay. What else? Well, this does mean higher costs of food. And here's some Chinese data where we're going to look at the cost of production of some of the main cereals in China in 2005, and there they are. Cost of production very low in China as recently as 2005, you know, round about the $100 to $120 per ton for most of the cereals. So nice cheap production. So you can see why China was keen on provisioning itself. Not only was it national food self-sufficiency, but it was also pretty economic. China was a very low-cost producer. But we run the clock on only 5 years, and there in constant terms are our updated estimates of the cost of production. If we look at rice national, we've gone from about $120 a ton to getting past $200 per ton. That's happened in 5 years. It's a heck of an increase. Some of that is rising oil prices, rising fertilizer prices, and so on. About half of that is the rising labor cost in China. Now that's quite a surprise there. Now if you're in Beijing when you're looking at that, and you're still probably quids in on producing some of those things nationally, but you're rapidly approaching a really important decision point. In China for 5,000 years, the logic has been China has to feed itself, has to keep enormous food stores. We can't depend on the outside world. Well, for 20-odd years, China has depended on the outside world for vegetable oil and for animal feed, with the huge imports of soybean. Well, if you can depend on the outside world for that reliably, at some point in China, they're going to say, should we just, you know, fold our cards on cereals, move to the high-value perishables which we need for our growing cities, and let our Asian neighbours supply us. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, they'll be delighted if China starts importing, say, 5 million tons of rice. Other parts of the world will start to get pretty delighted if China starts to import cereals. There are opportunities here in the future for land-abundant Latin America and land-abundant Africa as well. There is the potential for big increases in exports of food to China on this, which will transmit the gains from China to the rest of Asia, transmit the gains to from Asia to the rest of the world. And our third and last implication is this. The cost of manufacturing is going up. As the rural reservation wage goes up, people are less likely to go to the assembly plants in the coastal areas of China and wherever else to be paid a pittance. Those manufacturing wages costs are going up very rapidly in coastal China. We already now have assessments that a wage rate paid to manufacturing workers in Ethiopia is 1/4 to 1/5 of what you have to pay a worker in a Chinese assembly plant in the Pearl River Delta. 1/4 to 1/5. And we already have the pioneer factories from China which have crossed the Indian Ocean looking to take advantage of those lower labor rates, higher logistical costs, but I've been to a presentation from a Chinese entrepreneur that said, we're only there because of the numbers, we're ahead on the game, higher logistics costs, but the labor costs are so much lower. Now, Justin Lin has talked about, the ex-World Bank chief economist, wrote in May about more than 80 million manufacturing jobs being relocated outside of China. Now, some of those will go to the shrinking area. Thank goodness it's shrinking. The shrinking number of countries in Asia which are now LICs, low-income countries. That's Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Bangladesh, probably Nepal still. Not a lot more, actually. But if some of those were to cross the Indian Ocean, if, say, 40 million of those 80-odd million jobs were to leave China, cross the Indian Ocean, they would find in Africa, where you can see that age pyramid over on the left, that's the sub-Saharan age pyramid, Africa has a youth bulge coming through. One of the most beautiful marriages of convenience could happen over the next decade as China, looking for, again, cheap labor, meets the youth bulge of Africa. This could be a perfect marriage, as long as Africa can get the infrastructure and the business conditions to make Chinese entrepreneurs confident that they can do business in Africa. So there is as a final highly speculative point with lots and lots of ifs and conditions. The good news from Asia could be even better news for Africa. We've always said in African studies, we missed the boat, China's grabbed the manufacturing revolution, we have no chance in Africa, we're locked into primaries forever. Well, maybe not so. Maybe the jobs will come floating across the Indian Ocean. And I'll leave you with that as the last of the potential consequences of what we're seeing with the rising rural wages. Thank you.